All right, everyone, we are live. Dynasty Mirror Search for Huru. And we have Professor Davis with us once again. Let's get some more people in the chat room. But today we're going to be discussing um, the real truth behind Liberia as far as what happened. And also we're going to be discussing, can Black Panther, the movie, really unite? And the reason why we're discussing the whole Liberia issue along with Black Panther, because obviously, I don't know if you guys saw Black Panther. It was an excellent movie. It was a great movie, and of course, the I guess the conversation begins or starts, in regards to uh, African Americans starting a dialogue, a constructive dialogue with Africa. And then immediately, whenever you discuss African Americans going back to Africa and holding a dialogue with Africans, the whole Liberia incident or situation always comes up on how it will never work because of what happened in Liberia. So we've never really gotten I would say, a great explanation on what happened in Liberia. Is pretty much Black Americans came over and start killing all the natives. So I have our expert with us, Professor Davis, to really break it down. Professor Davis, thank you so much for coming on with us this afternoon.
Great, thanks for having me. And I hopefully I can clear up some misunderstandings about the history of Liberia. And I'll start here. Uh, Really, Liberia is the result of America's inability to deal with an increasingly free African American population in the Mid-Atlantic states and also some of the northern states. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you just fine. Hear you just fine.
Great, great. And so what it was is that you had a large number of Black Americans who were free, and unfortunately, white Americans did not see these people as their equals because they were chattel. They were formerly chattel, and so America thought, well, what can we do with these people here? They're not equal to us. They're our former slaves,
Hmm.
although they are free now. And so
Hey,
what do we do?
Professor Davis, not to cut you off. I just wanted somebody just said something in the chat room, and I'm gonna let you go. They said
Sure, sure.
before we even got started, she said in order for us to assimilate, we will need to first decolonize our minds to avoid repeating the disaster of Liberia. So what does that tell
Okay.
you? But go ahead,
Well,
go ahead.
and I'm going to jump it. I'm going to jump to what she's talking about here clearly, and I want to be very, very clear here. Uh, One must keep in mind that African Americans have lived in the United States for 500 years, and so when we began to repatriate Africa in the 1820s, more specifically 1822, uh, some of our ancestors had already been in the United States for 300 years. So you have a population that's fundamentally, if you will, American. In essence, we were Afro Saxons. And what I mean by Afro Saxons, we were Western, we were English speaking. Uh, Most of us were Christian in our orientation. And so we're going to Africa where those folks are still a part of their traditional African culture. Now, here's what happened in going back to Africa. As I stated earlier, Liberia really came about because America didn't know what to do with free blacks. Now, Paul Cuffey was a wealthy African American millionaire, a shipbuilder, and he was really the first black person to actually bring people back to Africa. As a matter of fact, in 1815, he used his own money, roughly $5,000 to $6,000, and transported some 30 or so blacks to Sierra Leone. And later on, the American Colonization Society kind of catch hold of that idea and they organize. And over time, what they were doing is basically providing funding or collecting funding so they could actually send African Americans back. Now, what's interesting is that a large majority of the African Americans who decided to go back to Africa, a lot of these folks were wealthy. For example, the first president of Liberia, who was Joseph Jenkins Roberts, who was from the Tidewater area of Virginia. Later on, he moved to Petersburg, Virginia. This guy was extremely wealthy. He was light skinned, he was mulatto, and quite a few of the first people who returned to Africa were actually mulattoes. And so once they got to Africa, they saw the indigenous population as somewhat different. Now, keep in mind, it took roughly 25 years or so of what Liberia had were colonial agents. And these were folks, the first colonial agent was white, the second was African American, the third was African Americans. What these people were doing is laying the foundation for a brand new society. Now, once they got to Africa, uh, there were some issues with negotiating with the chiefs in terms of land ownership. Africans, now keep in mind that the chief in Africa, basically, he was really in charge of everything. So this concept of individual land ownership was foreign to a lot of Africans, but
Hmm.
not to but not to Americans, Black Americans, and of course white Americans. And so over time, the Africans saw Black Americans as colonizers, as foreigners coming to kind of, if you will, take their land. And early on, there was an issue of a culture clash. And one of the issues is that all of the 16 existing tribes in Liberia were engaged in the slave trade, all of them.
Hmm.
And
Okay,
you must keep in,
can I ask a question real quick? When we say
sure,
slave,
sure.
is it slave trade by European definition, or is it more slave trade by, from what we
Okay,
usually hear, Africans didn't participate in the slave trade because there was no concept of slavery. It was
okay.
indentured servitude. Can
Okay,
you
good
break
question.
that down?
I'm gonna clarify that. There's a wonderful Liberian scholar. His name is Professor Carl Patrick Burroughs, and he's written this book that's called "Between the Cola Forest and the Salty Sea: A History of Liberia Prior to 1800."
Hmm.
And he goes before 1800. That's before African Americans begin settling in Liberia, because African Americans didn't get there until 1822. But what he's pointing out in this time frame is that the 16 tribes that are there are participating in the transatlantic slave trade. For example, there are many hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of African Americans who have ancestors from the area of what is now Liberia. And there are also hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people in the Caribbean who are also the descendants of those slaves who were brought from the area that used to be called the Grain Coast, which is now Liberia.
Hmm.
And what Joseph Jenkins Robbins actually saw, he was the first president, he actually saw people being loaded aboard ships, right,
Okay.
in West Africa and being shipped out. And so keep in mind, man, and I tell people all the time that this collective African identity did not occur in Africa. Pan Africanism occurs in the Americas among African Americans and West Indians and makes its way back to Africa. Africans never saw themselves as a collective people. So this is new. Like for example, even today, I mean, if you go to take for instance Nigeria, you have Yoruba, Hausas, Igbos, Afex, Sado, Ibibio, etc. And generally, people have historically viewed themselves in terms of their ethnic group.
Hmm.
This African Americans are unique. We are unique in the sense that there are 50 million, if you will, plus African Americans, and we are an amalgam of Africans from as far north as Mauritania, all the way through Madagascar, and we're blended, but we see ourselves as a single group,
Hmm.
and which is the beauty of it. But I want to get back to Liberia here.
Go
As I
ahead.
stated before, once the African Americans got there, unfortunately, Africans were slave trading, and they were participating in chattel slavery. And one of the reasons that they did, because they did not see themselves related to various warring kingdoms.
So we're on the same page. What you're saying is Liberians knew what the Africans who they captured, what their fate was going to be. Because the,
Well, let me
the
just
argument is
well,
that Africans had no clue that we were going to be treated the way we were treated once we got on the boats and sent to the West.
now keep in mind now, Liberia is the creation of, if you will, of African Americans returning, and also the American Colonization Society. So this new identity called Liberian is the result of Black Americans going back. Prior to that, the folks were Crew, Gia, Capella, etc., so on and so forth. After the African Americans came there and they established society, over time the population became known as Liberians. Now, here's also part of the problem too. Again, the African Americans who went back had wealth, they had education, they had organizational skills, and basically for 150 years or so, man, they really dominated politically, economically, socially, and and for example, there have been 25 presidents in Liberia. Of those 25, only three, if you will, have been quote unquote indigenous Africans. And what I mean by indigenous, folks who are, who are from that area. I hate to make this distinction between the so-called Americo-Liberians and the what they call country people or the indigenous Liberians, because one must keep in mind that the Americo-Liberians have been in Liberia for 200 years, so
Okay.
they are as much African as uh, the Liberians who were there before the area was actually established. I do want to say this too, Amir.
Go ahead.
By the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the nation of Liberia was firmly a middle income nation. As a matter of fact, man, it was one of the most prosperous countries on the African continent. And it had a per capita income equal to that of Japan.
Oh wow.
And so Liberia, in many respects, man, it was kind of like people would go there from all over Africa to live the Liberian dream. If you get a chance to ever, you're from Atlanta, and Atlanta has a large Liberian American
They
population.
do. I did. They do.
If if you ever get an opportunity to speak with some of the older people in their 50s, 60s, and they'll tell you that it was a dynamic society. In addition to what I just said, man, the OAU, now the AU, Liberia played a central role in the foundation of the Organization of African Unity, or the AU. It also played a central role in the establishment of the United Nations and the League of Nations.
Hmm.
I mean, Liberia was a serious player in terms of the African liberation movement. Keep in mind that during the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885, there were only two free nations in Africa: Liberia and Ethiopia. And
Okay.
so again, Liberia is serving, as the seat of freedom and representing freedom. Because think about this, man. Liberia gets its independence in 1847. Now, I will say this: Samuel Cannon Doe, who actually killed Tolbert assassinated in
It's static in the background you're in. Like I don't know if you're
1880.
rubbing your phone or
Okay, can you hear me now?
that's fine. That's fine. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Now, Samuel Cannon Doe in 1980 had Tolbert, who was the president, assassinated. And keep in mind that during that time in 1980, you're talking about a firmly
Let me ask you this:
middle in.
why was now Tolbert was American Liberian, correct?
Yes, yes, he was.
Why was he assassinated? If we could get into that.
Well, okay. Now, uh, again, here. This is what can be argued. The settler class, or the Americo-Liberian class, uh, perhaps could have done a better job of actually bridging the gap between themselves and the indigenous population. But a part of the problem is this again, that early on, the all of the indigenous tribes were slave trading. Also, too, unfortunately, some of the practices, some of the traditional African practices were actually problematic for uh, the returning African Americans. I mean, unfortunately, some of the Africans were actually participating in human sacrifice,
Okay.
and that's go
No,
ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead. I got a question for you, but go ahead. Finish your
And
statement.
so and so again, you're talking about a population who is fundamentally Western in their orientation, and they're returning to Africa, and there's a culture clash. There is a culture clash, and let me just say this to you too. and I don't want to jump too far ahead,
No, no, please go ahead. Go ahead.
and we were talking about early on at some point about the movie Black Panther. One of the beautiful things that I like about this movie is that it's actually showcasing more traditional African culture, which has not been valued.
Right.
And it's and what I find fascinating about this, it's actually being done by someone who is not a continental African. Ryan,
Let me interrupt you real quick. I made a
sure.
statement the other day several times that I feel as if Africans have not set the record straight when it comes to their indigenous culture. And people are like, well, Dinus, we're modernized now. And I'm like, well, people still don't understand it. And I think you need to set the record straight on that first. So you made a great point because I've been criticized on Dinus. Why do you spend so much time, I guess, in the bush or with these primitive people? And I'm like, well, it doesn't make sense to travel all the way to Africa and experience the same lifestyle that I could get right here in Atlanta. The culture is not in the city. That's my honest opinion. So it's funny that you said that because you're absolutely right. It was a Black American that really showcased the indigenous culture of Africa, which is important and is something that needs to be preserved and continue to be recognized. Because again, we just like when it comes to like voodoo, you have a lot of Africans who are now Christians and Muslims, which is something that, in my honest opinion, for the most part, is foreign Africa. But we can have that debate another day. And it's like, why won't you practice or preserve your indigenous religions? Because that's where the culture is at. But go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, and to answer that question to you from my perspective is that I think, unfortunately, and I'm not a psychologist. I'm a professor, but I'm not a psychologist. I think maybe in the subconscious mind of a lot of Africans, they view their traditional culture as not having anything to offer, which is problematic. I mentioned Hugh Masekela, who was a famous South African jazz singer last time, who recently passed
Right.
away.
Uh-huh.
What he was doing in Africa is actually creating heritage sites across the African continent because he was trying to get Africans to preserve something because the younger generation
Well, preserve it.
are rapidly right. They are rapidly adopting Western culture. Now,
Right.
Amir, I always make the argument. Listen, I understand why African Americans are the way they are. We were a captive people in a foreign land for 500 years, and so we had to kind of adopt English and the dominant culture of the day. But I think what you have on the African continent is for and don't get me wrong, I believe in modernity and development and these types of things, but I personally think it's extremely important for you to preserve something about yourself. For example, I've traveled extensively to six continents.
Hmm.
I've visited Chinatowns all over the globe. Wherever you go across this planet, the Chinese are Chinese
Right.
all over the globe.
Correct.
The same thing with India. And all that I'm saying is that there's nothing wrong with modernity and development, which are good things. But I also think that it's great to preserve your own specific authenticity.
Okay.
And so that's what I'm saying. But the Liberia experience, man, I think that it really is a lesson for us all, man, to really understand that culture is important. We now also I will say this too, man. The settler class or the African or the Americo-Liberians, or they're also called Congo people,
Hmm.
didn't get everything right, man. However, what they did get right, man, think about this, man. You had a formerly enslaved population going back and really establishing, man, a firmly middle income nation by the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, they did this. And I think that unfortunately there was how do I say that there was some degree of I guess animosity because unfortunately too that the settler class were the elites. They were a lot of these folks had not only had actually come with money, but they had gained more money as well too. And they could have done a better job, as I said, of integrating the indigenous population into the new Liberian paradigm or mainstream. However, as I said earlier, some of the practices of the Africans, i.e., slave trade, human sacrifice, were also problematic. And I do want to say this too.
Go ahead.
Prior to that civil war, or prior to the assassination of Tolbert, again, man, Tubman earlier had actually unified Liberia through his open door policy, because what he was trying to do is to ensure that the so-called country people, or the indigenous population, again, were benefiting from Liberia, as a new nation. But unfortunately, because of jealousy, and perhaps some outside forces, Liberia fell into a 14-year civil war, which really destroyed this wonderful country, man. I mean, it was prior to the assassination of Tolbert,
Okay.
and the Civil War. It was one of the wealthiest nations on the African continent for sure. And this is documented information through the United Nations.
Okay. Now, when the native Liberians were trading slaves, because again, the idea was, or the what's being presented is by many Africans and Black Americans, is that there was no concept of chattel slavery. They didn't know that they were what the slaves were going to face once they got on those boats and were in the West. What were they trading? I mean, they were trading slaves for what and with who?
Oh my God, for guns, for
Uh-huh.
whiskey, these type for trinkets. I mean, it was, and again, man, keep in mind, and I tell people that the concept of a collective African identity did not exist on the African continent.
Right.
This emerges in the West. I mean, Pan-Africanism is is from the diaspora. It is
Right.
from the United States. It's from the West Indies for sure. It makes its way back to Africa.
Right.
So these people did not see themselves like African Americans. Like, you're from Atlanta. I'm
Right.
from the state of Maryland. We're African Americans. You and I have a more or less the same culture.
Right.
You know, they didn't see themselves that way, and Africans, unfortunately, don't see themselves. Listen, I personally believe that the Black diaspora is going to play more of a leading role in really bringing Africans, if you will, together as a collective people,
I agree. I
because
completely
of
agree.
our experience in the West.
Right. Let me ask you this. What are you familiar with Martin Delany?
Of course, I am.
Can you somewhat speak on his involvement in regards to Liberia and somewhat of his,
Well,
and why he
he
left Africa to just to recruit Black soldiers for the Civil War?
right, right. I think he, and I can't remember the Jamaican gentleman who had traveled to the area, what is now Liberia, not Liberia, but Nigeria. He went, I believe, in 1859, looking for a space that African Americans could settle in West Africa. Long story short, with Mr. Delany, who's a renowned figure in African American history, is that he basically came to the realization: listen, I'm an American, and my fate is within the United States. So therefore, perhaps it's really best that we stay in America. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with it's called the Negro Convention of 1830.
I'm not. No.
This is when this is when the intellectual classes of African Americans
Hey, bro. I was
came
gonna
together.
say there's a lot of like static, like you're rubbing your phone maybe on a shirt, or if that makes
Okay,
sense.
can you hear me?
Yeah, that's
Can you hear
perfect.
me
Go ahead.
now?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. I guess I need to stop holding my phone. I apologize about that. But no, there was something called the Negro Convention Movement of 1830, and it was the intellectual class of African Americans came together, and they were considering where should they go from here because of they were being discriminated against due to white supremacy.
Right.
And this movement was actually led by we spoke about Richard Allen, right?
Briefly.
Richard Allen was the founder, of course, of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and in the 1780s. But long story short, man, uh, the African American leadership seriously considered a mass migration to Canada, and
Brother Professor Day, it's still the noise, like the
you know, hold on one second. Let me see if I can take off my earpiece,
okay.
and you know,
Yeah, it's probably the
and I'm gonna
mic
see.
on your earpiece, probably rubbing against your shirt.
Hello,
Yeah, go ahead.
is that much better?
Oh, it's perfect. Perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, great, great. I just took off my headset, so I'm sorry about that. I
No problem.
apologize to the audience as well too.
Oh, no problem.
And as I say that, the black leadership in this Negro convention movement in the 1830s were considering a mass migration into Canada, but the Canadians said no, we don't need millions of Negroes, if you will, coming northward. And so again, basically the group decided to kind of look, we are American, and so maybe we should just make our beds here. And
Hmm.
so they decided to stay. And that was the exact same thing with Martin Delany. I mean, he did go to what is now Nigeria with a Jamaican gentleman. I can't his name escapes me right now, but he decided, well, we've spent hundreds of years building this country, so maybe we should give it a try here. And they decided to kind of stay within the confines of the United States.
Okay. Now, did he play a role with in regards to Liberia at all, or was it just strictly Nigeria?
Well, it really wasn't Nigeria because Nigeria wasn't a
Right.
country during that
It was
time. Right.
the homie, I believe, the homie.
Right, right, and it was an amalgam of different kingdoms. You had the Oyo Empire, of course, the Yoruba, so on and so forth,
Okay.
and but of course later on the British came and they created this place that we now call Nigeria, which is they just wove together. My God, man, the Igbo, Biafra parts of Yoruba, the northern House of Fulani area into what is now Nigeria and all of that. But it's
They,
kind of an awesome state.
they said the guy's name was Robert Campbell.
Right, Robert Campbell is the gentleman. Yes, he traveled to what is now Nigeria with Martin Delany
Okay.
in 18. I believe it was 1859, I believe.
Okay. So why are American Liberians blamed for
Big-
the situation in
Well,
Liberia?
good question, man. It is because they were the intellectual, education, political, and financial elite of Africa. They basically came, they established the country, they ruled it for 150 years. And early on they were a single party system. But again, the reason that they were, man, is that there were cultural differences. There were cultural differences, man. And think about this, man. And Liberia was problematic from the beginning because, again, as I stated to you before, it was America's inability to deal with black folks in the United States. They wanted to get rid of African Americans.
Hmm.
But at the same time, these people had the tenacity to go 5,000 miles away and create something. And like I say, by 1970, 1980, it was middle income. But it was a lot of it had to do with the fact that this was the political and economic elite.
Uh-huh. All
And
right. So
that's,
go ahead.
and
Go ahead.
and to be very honest with you today, Liberia is a hot mess today. And pardon that expression, but it is. And the so-called American Liberians, which they are Liberians, because they were the founders of the modern country, man, they still have significant influence in Liberia in terms of wealth and property, without question. Um, and even after Doe came to power, who was a crew, I'm sorry, he was a Kra, and he was a quote unquote, an indigenous Liberian. He did some of the most awful things, man. I mean, it was actually tribal warfare. Here's the crazy thing, man. During the Civil War, because the American Liberians had money, capital, most of them left the country. They ended up coming back to the United States, or they settled in, in parts of Europe or in parts of Africa. And so when the Civil War was going on, the vast majority of the people who were being killed were so-called indigenous Africans.
Hmm. During the Liberian Civil War.
Absolutely. The
Okay, so
vast majority.
okay, in the Liberian Civil War, was it the sorry about that? Was it the Americo-Liberians versus the indigenous? Like who
Oh
was fighting?
no, 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 no. Many of the American Liberians had left because they had capital. They had money. A lot of them left and came back to the United States, or some settled in Ghana or in the Ivory Coast, and they were actually operating from the outside. So the war really, at that time, man, most of the people who almost all of the people who perished during the war were indigenous Africans who were fighting because of that, because of the tribal differences. And keep in mind, man, that Tubman and Tolbert had unified the country up until 1980. Tubman had this open door policy where he was trying to kind of integrate more of the indigenous groups into mainstream Liberian culture.
Wow, wow. What so what was going on in so I'm trying to figure out then why are Americo
Because
Liberians vilified then? Like I just you say
because
money because they have
a
money?
lot a, oh, absolutely. A lot of it had to do with jealousy, man. And again, think about this, man. Here it is, you have former slaves coming back. And keep in mind, Amir, most of these people who settled in Liberia, well, a lot of them had money. They had money before going to Liberia. For example, as I said before, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, who was the first president of Liberia, he was wealthy. He was
Right.
a wealthy merchant before going there, man. He already had money. And a
Hmm.
lot of them, and again, these were the folks, man, who really founded the country, wrote the Constitution, established its borders, right? And they were the political and economic elite, man, all the way up until, my God, maybe 20 years ago.
Mm.
And so, some Liberians view them, and I'm going to put it in this context.
Go ahead.
They view the whole Americo-Liberian and, if you will, Liberian situation almost like black and white in the United States.
So basically
Some
the
of them.
Americo Liberians were considered white, I guess.
Well, they consider them as a settler class,
Okay.
and but they were wealthy, very very wealthy, and basically they control the economy, the political, the economic, and the social affairs of Liberia without question. And the reason again why they did not do more to integrate with the indigenous population is because slavery was the business of the day. Once they got there beginning in 1822, the slave trade was in full effect.
Uh-huh.
And again, if you read some of the papers of the first president, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, he's talking about uh, how these tribes are engaging in slavery. And Joseph Jenkins Roberts is also writing back to the U.S. government, and he's saying, "Listen, I am intercepting these slave ships headed to the west." Now, what he does do, he's able to stop some of the ships, save some of the slaves, and those slaves are integrated into the broader Liberian society.
Hmm.
Many of those who are integrated into the broader Liberian society, those people are known as Congo people.
Okay.
So it's Liberia is a complicated history, man. It's a very, 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 very complicated history. I would argue that if the Civil War would have never happened, again, Liberia would probably be one of the wealthiest nations in Africa today. But unfortunately, it's quite impoverished, and a lot of it had to do with once Tolbert got killed, it really destroyed the country. In
Hmm.
1980, that was the beginning of the destruction of a middle-income African nation that had been quite prosperous. But again,
And
a
so
lot of it had, but a lot of it had to do with the fact that that the American Liberian were the political economic elite, and they had a lot of money. And I think human nature being what it is, some people had a tendency to look down on the indigenous folk who were culturally different. And keep in mind, you're having folks also to coming from a formerly enslaved condition, you know, and so that was also a part of the process too. But going back to what I said earlier, the root of the problem was really the U.S. Not dealing with its black population in the United States and saying to African Americans, you're not wanted here. You're not wanted in this country. So,
All right, somebody said in the chat room that they didn't integrate the local Africans because U.S. told African Americans they could have their own country in Africa on other people's land. American Liberians thought they had their own country. Is that true?
well, and again, man, now I do want to say this to you too, man. There was a lot of mixing. As a matter of fact, man, there were many, many, many people who married some of the local tribes, and and there was no issue.
Hmm.
And so and but again, I think that the biggest issue is that it was a culture clash early on.
Hmm.
African kings, let's just say if you were a crew king in Liberia, the king basically was in control of all of the property. And so
Right.
it was kind of communal. It was kind of communal. American Liberians, again, man, they were Western in their orientation. And so it was like personal property. So once you negotiated with, let's just say, the king for for the sale of a specific plot of land, once that sale was complete, in your mind, that land belongs to you. In the mind of a crew, gentlemen, he had no concept of personal property at all. So again, the issue with Liberia really was a culture clash, and the culture clash was between traditional African values and the African Americans who were returning, who were Western in their orientation, who did make an attempt, man, to kind of integrate, but again, they wanted the indigenous Africans to kind of accept their values because they thought that their values were more superior than the Africans.
Okay. All right, cool. All right, perfect. Now, what are your thoughts on Black Panther? I mean, we spoke offline, and people are thinking that Black Panther could be a platform to open up dialogue between Black Americans and Africans. And my argument with you was, well, what happened after Roots? What happened after Coming to
Well,
America? It just, in fact, I
right.
think after Roots, it might have got worse because, of course, when Africans would come to America, we would call them Kuta Kinte and all this other stuff, derogatory names. And then with Coming to America, the best thing that came out of Coming to America as far as African and African American relations was just funny memes like, if his mama call him Cassius Clay, I'm gonna call him Cassius Clay. And Randy Watson and sexual
Here's
chocolate. That's the best thing to come out of that movie. So, but you think that Black Panther can unite? Why?
Well, you know what, and you know what, I've been online, man, and I've been watching what's been going on around the globe, man. In Brazil, for example, in Brazil, man, they were actually having like these parties from northern Brazil to southern Brazil, where they would take their kids to to watch this film because in Brazil, which is a nation that's predominantly African, unfortunately, they don't have any representation in terms of government, real international figures, and so on and so forth. And I've also spoke to friends of mine in South Africa, in Ghana, and all over the place, and and they really believe that this movie is a hit because, man, it's an authentic representation of real African culture. And the beautiful part about this, Amir, is that it was done by an African American filmmaker who took the time to really investigate what Africa is, and he showed to Africans, hey, there's nothing wrong. You should not be embarrassed by your culture. For the longest time, and I think that what you've been seeing is that the West has actually been projecting or marketing what should be. This is really one of the first times in history where you had a very, very diverse cast of people: African Americans, continental Africans, Africans from South America, Africans from the West Indies, working together as a group, man, to to share with the globe, what their future could be. And the beautiful thing also about this too is that Ryan Coogler reimagined an Africa that had never been colonized,
Right.
which is pretty amazing. And I find this fascinating that here it is again. Coogler is an African American.
Right.
He's he's presenting, if you will, this image along with others to the entire world that look, here's what we can do if we work together collectively as a group.
Right.
And so do I think that this is going to make a change? Well, you and I have talked off the offline, and I've given you many, many, many examples of where African Americans are already engaged across the continent and have been so for a very, very long time. I mean, as I told you again about Africare, which is grassroots, the Constituency for Africa, which works mainly with government agencies, the Africa America Institute, which has a footprint in all 54 countries and doing all types of wonderful things. Now they're aligning themselves with the NAACP and other African American civic organizations. So things are happening. So I see it from my standpoint, where especially where African Americans are engaging, and I think that Africans are being somewhat reciprocal. Now I will say this. I think that because unfortunately right now most African nations are very new and they haven't been independent for a long time, that perhaps they don't have the funding to be as I guess engaging as Black Americans. And what I mean by that, our institutions are old, man. A lot of our institutions are quite old. And so we've been around for a long time. And so we're able to kind of reach, if you will, across the ocean and say, listen, here's what we need to do.
Hello? You
Yes,
there?
I'm here. Yes.
Okay, okay, okay,
Yes.
okay. Okay, I thought I lost you. Yeah, so how do you feel about Killmonger's character uh in Black Panther?
Oh, wow. Let me just say this, man. Some people would actually view him, see him as a representation of, John Hendrick Clark, Professor John Hendrick Clark said that African Americans are the lonely African nation away from home.
Right.
And basically one could say that Killmonger is, of course, he's African American in the film, and he's the representation, man, of struggle, in a sense, being somewhat marginalized by the mother country, reaching out as best as he can for some type of connection with Africa, and maybe Africans not necessarily knowing how to kind of respond to him because, again, how do as I said to you before, the concept of a collective African identity is not African. It's not. It's from the diaspora, and so I think maybe African Americans should take that into consideration. That while we're trying to reach out to Africa, Africans may not reciprocate in the same way because they don't see themselves that way. And if they do, man, this is relatively new for them and not for us. I think that we share more in common with West Indians and Blacks in the New World because of that shared experience of being formerly chattel in the Western world.
Okay. Hey, so somebody made a comment, and let's get back to the Civil War again. Somebody
Sure.
said there was an entire civil war on this. Indigenous Liberians lived through this. This has no merit of validity. This is laughable. Okay, so the Civil War. Who fought in the Civil War, and why are Americo-Liberians blamed for what happened?
Right, because they were the intellectual political elites on the African continent, man, and the so-called country people or the indigenous Liberians, man, felt somehow neglected because here it is, you have a population of roughly 5%, which really is the aristocracy of Liberia. Now, again, as I said earlier, man, one of the reasons why American Liberians were reluctant to kind of engage Africans because they were slave trading. And Amir, you have to keep in mind, man, you're talking about an informally, you're talking about a formerly enslaved population returning to Africa, and people actually seeing people bought and sold and put on ships,
Hmm.
to be sent to the Americas. And they're thinking to themselves, oh my God. I mean, some of them were just released from slavery yesterday, and they're seeing people being bought and sold in the area that would become a Liberia. And again, that area is called the Windward Coast or the Gold Coast. I'm sorry, the Grain Coast. And as I said before, man, there was an article just 2 years ago that the former president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, was talking about, and she was mentioning human sacrifice. And unfortunately, that's one element of African culture, man, which is just problematic. And just these two examples, man, are something that African Americans saw fundamentally as foreign, and they distanced themselves, man, from these parts of African culture. I mean, you got to think about
So,
this,
so
man.
okay, so let me ask you, not to cut you off again. So did American Liberians, okay, pick up AK-47s, all right, and were they running around shooting indigenous
Oh
Liberians?
no, 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 no. That did not happen at all. No, no, no. That you're talking about during the Civil War.
Right.
Oh no, 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 no. Listen, most of the war was among those indigenous tribes. And again, man, the so-called American Liberians were never ever no more than 5% of the national population. They were never ever a large part of the population. They were the political and economic elite. The 250,000 or so people who were killed in Liberia, most of them, the overwhelming majority of those folks, man, were indigenous Africans, because the American Liberians, yes, some of them passed away, but the vast majority of them had wealth. They could leave, and many of them did, and they came back to the United States, or they went to Europe, or they went to Ghana, and so on and so forth. The indigenous Africans did not have that type of wealth at all.
Okay. So I just don't understand why people are saying that, they make it seem as if the American Liberians were the ones that picked up the guns and were running around and shooting people and
No,
cutting people
no, no,
head.
no, no, no. That didn't happen at all. And keep in mind, man, prior to the Civil War or prior to the assassination of Tolbert in 1980, again, Liberia was one of the wealthiest countries on the African continent. That is for sure. Listen, I do hope, man, within the next week or so, you would reach out to, there's a Liberian American Association in Atlanta. And if you Google it or dial it, ask to speak to some of the older Liberians in terms of what the country was like in the 1970s in terms of quality of life. And they'll tell you, man, that it was a prosperous nation.
Hmm. Okay.
So uh, go ahead, go ahead.
No, 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 no. You go ahead. Go ahead. So we were
And
talking about Killmonger, I believe.
Right. And so all that I'm saying, it wasn't a perfect nation. As with all countries, they have their issues in terms of, in terms of social issues. But again, man, here it is, a formerly enslaved population created a brand new nation, a brand new nationality. They also, man, were on the cutting edge in terms of developing the AU, the Organization of African Unity. As I stated before, they were also a founding member of the United Nations and the League of Nations, and they served as a light man for other emerging pre-colonial African nations. Keep in mind that Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African nation to get its independence in 1957. Liberia was free in 1847. And during the Berlin Conference, 1884, 1885, when all of Africa had been colonized within 20 years, Liberia and Ethiopia were the only two nations to maintain its independence. And even Amir, when the British, the French, and the Germans came to the United States, and they said to America, What's your take on Liberia? Is that your colony? And America was slow to respond. And so those nations tried to colonize Liberia. And as I stated to you earlier, man, the U.S. ambassador to Liberia, and his name escapes me right now, reached out to Booker T. Washington and said, President Washington, he was the president of Tuskegee University at the time, or Tuskegee Institute. He says, listen, Liberia is in trouble. And he explained to them that the Germans, the French, and the British were trying to colonize this part of West Africa. As a matter of fact, they took parts of Liberia, what is now present day part of the Ivory Coast, and also parts of Sierra Leone. And but anyway, what Washington did was invite a contingency of 12 or so, or I forgot the number, Liberian politicians over the course of 5 years to come to the United States, and they negotiated. And make a long story short, Washington was able to get a loan from the United States, basically helping Liberia to pay off some debts because it was a new nation, and it saved Liberia from being colonized by European colonial powers. Now there were strings attached to it, but it ensured that Liberia maintained its autonomy. That was the second time, and that was during the Liberian crisis. The first time that this happened was when Elijah Johnson, who was the third colonial agent, who happens to be African American. He sailed on the Elizabeth in 1920 from New York, first to Sierra Leone, and then later on to Liberia. And he served as in I think it was 1822 as the third what they call colonial agent. And while there, the British came to Liberia, came on shore, and asked to speak to Elijah Johnson. And the British says, listen, we want to allow us to plant our flag on Liberian soil. If you do that, it will ensure that you're saved from the natives. And Elijah Johnson says, absolutely not. We don't want you or any European power, to plant your flag here, because if that happens, it's gonna cost us more money to take it down later on. That was the first time that Liberia was saved from European colonial powers, and that was in 1822. The second time was Booker T. Washington in 1905 through 1912, and that was during the Liberian crisis.
Somebody, when somebody says that Liberia is a colony of the USA, what would be your argument to that?
Well, I would say Liberia grew out of the United States, but it was its own sovereign nation without question. And it worked very closely with the United States. I mean, if you look at the Liberian Constitution, it's more or less the same as the United States. Now, here's one difference. When the African Americans returned or created Liberia, they have a clause in their Constitution that states that no white person can own property in Liberia.
Okay. So somebody said, let's see here. I don't know how it seems as if you know more about African Liberian history than any African Liberian. So educate me. Tell me the American returnees to Liberia, how the American returnees to Liberia helped the people and didn't gain control of the cost and key assets. Tell me why Matilda Newport Day is no longer celebrated. Do you know anything about that?
Well, let me just say this, man, and keep in mind, man, there are when it comes. I'm a member of the Liberian Historical Society, right?
Okay.
And it's based out of Houston, Texas, man. And I will say this in regards to Liberian history. For those who are, and keep in mind this Congo country debate, which is common during the political, which is common during election, is really problematic, man. I think a part of the issue is this, man, is that one of my Liberian American friends said this to me. If he said to me, why didn't the indigenous Liberians build their own country? He said that to me. He says, what will happen, Professor David, is that many of the indigenous Liberians who, he adds, should be grateful that even during the Civil War, that they were able to come to the United States, because they wouldn't have been able to come to the United States without African Americans in the first place, because there would be no Liberia if there were no African Americans. And so these people have benefited, if you will, again, from from African Americans or either from the Americo-Liberians. And this, and this debate back and forth, man, is this. The Americo-Liberians have been out of power for 40 years. The vast majority of the people who are elected right now are quote unquote country people. Liberia today, man, is unfortunately now with the indigenous population in control, one of the most corrupt nations in Africa.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow. Let's see.
So it's really, but again, man, when Tubman and Tolbert was in power, it worked. It worked, man. It was Alexander Benedict Cummings was running for president, man, in this year, and he didn't win. George Weah won, and he is a Liberian American, well, a Liberian national. Now he went back to run for public office, but he was not elected, and he's 60, 62, I believe. And he said, I heard him in an interview. He said that, look, when I was in Liberia in the 70s, he said it was one of the most successful nations in Africa. And that's true. This is, I actually sent you something, Amir. It was a brief 22-minute film. It was called The Wealth of Liberia. I don't know if you got a chance to look at that clip that I sent you. And basically, it's an overview of what Liberia was doing in the 1970s. And this is when Tolbert was actually the president of the Organization of African Unity, now the AU. But again, man, many of the Liberian Americans who were here in the United States have benefited from the Americo-Liberians because those are the folks who actually built the country. Can you hear me?
I hear you. I hear you. So the question becomes then, if the Americo-Liberians were so bad, why would Liberians leave Liberia and flee to where the Americo-Liberians came from?
Oh, the Civil War.
I know, but why?
And keep in mind, man. Go ahead.
Yeah, but why would they flee and they come to America where the hold on, Tay, I don't understand your question, Tay. You're typing the questions like word by word, and like just ask the question in just one line. Why would the okay, so if the Americo-Liberians are so bad, why would Liberians leave Liberia, flee Liberia to where the Americo-Liberians originated from? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and right, and I think, man, that during the Civil War, and which lasted for 14 years, I think it started in '89. I think it ended, I think, in 2003, I believe. And I think that the Civil War, man, can be brutal, and so you're trying to get away and to reestablish your life and these types of things. But again, to me, that the easiest answer is to get away from the Civil War.
Mhm.
But again, man, when you speak to the older generation of those Liberians, they'll tell you if that war never happened, they would have stayed. I mean, Amir, it was, Africans from all over the continent went to Liberia to live the Liberian dream. I'm serious. It was that nice.
Right.
I mean, it's that nice, man. I'm telling you. It was an amazing country before the Civil War.
Hmm. Okay. No, he does. Yeah, the person doesn't want to respond because I asked him, would Liberia? I mean, there'd be no Liberia if there weren't any Afro-Liberians. And he said he's not gonna give a serious response to that question. Have a good day. So he doesn't want to respond.
Well, no, it's true. No. And honestly, man, and here's the it's a look. As I told you before, man, some people view the whole Liberian thing is like black and white in the United States. And it's and again, I don't want to minimize anybody experience because the war, man, destroyed 250,000 lives. I mean, it was an ugly part of African history. It really was. I wish somehow, man, that Tolbert, well, you know what? There some people will say that there were outside forces beyond, why Tolbert and and part of his administration was actually assassinated. But I know after that happened, Samuel Cannondeau came into power, and he was there for 10 years, and he was actually eventually Charles Taylor got rid of him, among others. But it's a really really sad part of of the history. But even with Charles Taylor, he was elected, I think, twice, but he was, of course, accused of war crime. The UN stepped in. There were interim governments, and eventually, man, in 2006, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, man, was actually elected for 2 terms. Now, Mrs. Johnson Sirleaf is interesting because she, her parents were a part of, as I told you before, a part of the ward system, and the ward system was where a prominent American Liberian family would actually kind of not adopt, but take, if you will, bring what they were trying to do is to kind of integrate, if you will, the indigenous population into the Western style of living, and so people from the interior would be brought to American Liberians, educated, and and so on and so forth. This is what happened to Mrs. Sirleaf. She was reared, or she was a part of the ward system in Liberia. She had, she was raised by wealthy American Liberian families.
Hmm.
And again, man,
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
and again, it really is a culture clash. It really, because again, the African Americans were fundamentally Western, fundamentally. They had already been in the United States prior to going to Liberia for 300 years. And again, you're having people who are returning to Africa, who are English speaking, who are Christian, who are American, and they're and they're engaging with people who are traditional Africans and whose cultures are fundamentally different. And that was a part of the problem, man. And and like I say, the issue that a lot of Liberians don't, indigenous Liberians don't mention is the element of slavery, and that's real. That is real. All 16 of those tribes were slave trading, all of them.
Okay. Somebody said that I don't blame America Liberians for the Liberian Civil War, but I'll always be disappointed by the arrogance of the American Liberians. What are your thoughts on that comment?
Okay. I get that point. And again, you're put it to you this way, man. I'll put it in contemporary terms. It's almost like you, Amir, and I'm not putting you on the spot, man,
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go
coming from
ahead.
the United States, that the United States is, is the wealthiest, I mean, is the most powerful nation on the face of the globe. It's like you going to, and I'm not saying you do this, but it's like you going to Haiti, and I'm just using this as an example, as a group, and you're interacting with Haitians. Here it is, you're coming, you're sophisticated, you're wealthy, you have resources, and you're going to Haiti, which is a developing country. And I think that's what he's talking about, or she's talking about. You have, now, although many of these people were ex-slaves, again, some of them were free blacks, some of them were free people of color. Like I say, man, many of these African Americans who went to Liberia were wealthy, and they had skills and education, and they built the country.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a part of it. And were they arrogant? Absolutely. Some of them were. And some of them mistreated the indigenous population because, again, they were technologically, militarily more superior.
Is that okay?
I mean, that's, I
No, no,
mean,
you're right.
sure. And think about this, man. I mean, look, I'm going to put this in context for you.
Go ahead.
The American Liberians never, ever were more than 5% of the population. They were a tiny, tiny minority. for 150 years before uh, Samuel Doe assassinated Tolbert, they were in power.
Hmm.
And they were, and a lot of them were extremely wealthy. And to be very honest, even though they are no longer in political power today, still many of the families of the American Liberians still have property in Liberia. Many of them are outside of the country, and they're in the U.S. and Europe and whatever, but they still have economic influence even today because
Hmm.
they were the established. These are the folks who established the country.
Hold on, Ingrid, are you from Liberia, Ingrid? And is every do you agree with everything brother Professor Davis is saying? I'll go ahead, Professor Davis.
Right, right, and and so again, at this point, there was some degree of integration. I mean, like Charles Taylor, for example, his father was an American Liberian, his mother was a Gola. I think it was Gola, I believe. And so again, there are quite a few people who are mixed, and so there was some degree of integration, but I think that the huge part of the issue is that you had the American Liberians who really controlled a lot of the country for a very, very long time. And but now in 2018, George Weah, who's actually Crew, and one of the most famous soccer players, African soccer players on the planet, probably the most famous African soccer player on the planet. He's now the elected president of Liberia. And so many of the political figures now are, if you will, indigenous.
Hey, let me ask you this. Okay, so the in regards to Africa reaching back out to Black Americans, the excuse is, well, Africa has their own problems. We're fighting our own wars. We have our own tribal issues. But from what I've learned is even though we went through Jim Crow, Reconstruction, and slavery, we were still reaching out and helping Africa. How do you feel
Sure.
about that excuse that Africans can't help out African Americans because they have all their problems, but during our problems, we always made it a point to reach out to them?
Right. Well, you know what? A good friend of mine, Professor Suleiman Yang, who's from the Gambia, he used to be the former chair of African Studies at Howard University. He has since retired. And again, man, I think what resonates with blacks in the diaspora is the period of the transatlantic slave trade. We, and I'm going to answer your question specifically. And I think that because of that experience, man, and the fact that we were disconnected from our motherland, many of us, especially the conscious ones of us, are trying to reconnect in a real way. Africans on the continent tend not to feel the same way because they haven't lost anything culturally. You follow what I'm saying? And when it comes to the transatlantic slave trade, these types of things, it's not taught in African culture. And so therefore there's a disconnect. And there's a disconnect on the end really from, from highly educated Africans because they don't see themselves as really a part of us in that way. And so that's the complexity of it, man. I think that it's it's going to have to be a slower process. And I think that the way it happens is at the level of our institutions. And as I said earlier, man, I think that because African Americans are in the wealthiest nation on the planet for now, and we have long-standing institutions going back hundreds of years, we probably are in a better position to kind of reach out than they are because most of the countries in Africa are relatively young. They haven't been independent for a long time, and they do have a lot of problems, man. A lot of, I mean, and so they're at a point where they don't. Again, they're just coming into their own. They're just coming into their own. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it makes sense. It makes sense.
And so we're kind of like in a very unique position to kind of reach out, and we're doing this, man. And I just don't think Africans have the tools really to do it yet. And so uh, we'll have to take the lead.
Hold on, hold on. Let me interrupt real quick. AAXX, that's false. Africans are not completely aware of the slave trade. I can tell you that right now. My experience in Africa, many Africans have no clue about the. There are some Africans that have no clue as far as how the impact that slavery had on Africa, or even they're not even taught slavery in schools.
This is
So
true.
that
This
so
is very true.
that's a lie, AAXX, and I can tell you that from experience. All right, go ahead,
No, they
Professor.
don't. No, let me just. My friend and one of my mentors, Professor Suleiman Yang, as I stated, who has retired now, he said that Africans, for the most part, do not teach the legacy of slavery.
That's
He
not.
said,
Hold on, one second. AAXX. That's not true. You don't understand. Like when I was in Dogon country, they brought up slavery. They were like, "Yeah, well, we kind of heard that some of our brothers were shipped off, but yeah, we don't know much about it." They don't. They might know about it since they've been here in America, but a lot of Africans cannot resonate at all with the slave trade. It's just pretty much, yeah, a couple of some people were, sent over to the West. But anyways, off to the next subject. I'm telling you, they don't have an idea about slavery. It's not taught it's not even colonialism is not even taught in African schools. But go ahead. I'm sorry, Professor Davis.
and that's right, man. Slavery resonates more with blacks in the diaspora than it does with Africans on the continent.
Mhm.
And because again, we were specifically for Black Americans, we are and were a minority in a sea of whiteness, and and so therefore, I mean, we had to kind of view ourselves collectively as a group because of white supremacy. Africans on the continent are in the majority. I was talking to a Nigerian friend of mine 2 weeks ago, and he said to me, he says that Professor Davis, I didn't realize I was black until I came to the United States. As he said to me, listen, everyone in Nigeria looks like me. He says, now there are class issues, but in terms of race, race was something that I never had to think about until I got to America. And so I think that's a part of it, man. And even with the immigrant population, what I'm learning, man, is that very few immigrants, black, white, what have you, they don't take the time to learn true American history. And it is impossible to know American history without knowing African American history because African Americans are anchored in all aspects of U.S. history. You cannot extract the Black American experience from the United States. It's central to our story, slavery, and even the Constitution. The Constitution mentions the African Americans more than any other group in the United States because
Go ahead and finish. But I got it. Somebody just asked a great question, Professor Davis. But go ahead and finish your
sure.
statement. I'll ask it. Go ahead and finish your statement. I'll ask it.
Right. I was going to say, man, that that of course African Americans have fought in all wars. I mean, our contributions is is central and core to the American experience.
Okay. Somebody made a great point. Why? Let's see. Where is it? Why are What's wrong with the NAACP writing a letter or black politicians? And this could be going on. We just might not be privy to the information. Writing a letter to the African Union to broker a means for our skilled cousin and nieces to return home, or build some collective together.
Well, okay, you know what? Now the African Union, man, basically has 6 regions, right?
I
They have six.
I think so. I'm not sure. I thought they were just all one. But go ahead.
Okay, 5 of the regions are on the African continent. The sixth region is the Black diaspora. So in essence, there is already something in place where the sixth region is engaging with the African continent. So now, with that specific question that your guest has, I don't know if that's the case, but again, the sixth region represents the Black diaspora: African Americans, Cubans.
See, well, let me cut you off. I've heard this before, but they just didn't allow Haiti into the African Union. So I don't know which African Union we're talking about, because what benefits does the Black Americans get in the African Union? Because we're never included in the conversation. And then, like I said, when Haiti applied to join the African Union, they weren't allowed.
This is true, man. And again, I just think that and I don't want to make any excuses for the African Union in terms of how they look at their political, how they make their decisions. But what I can say is that I think writing a letter, the NAACP, that could be maybe something that's important. As I shared with you not too long ago, man, that there is an alliance already with the NAACP and the Africa American Institute, right, which was actually solidified in January of this year. And so, I do think that in the future, man, that those two organizations are gonna be working in conjunction with probably the AU, man, to make some things happen.
Mhm.
But but I do want to say, man, that I see changes on the horizon. I really do, man. I honestly think right now that we're living in a dynamic time where uh, we are seeing some of the beginning stages of, if you will, the global Black family, coming together. And I think that we're beginning to realize that even through the film like the Black Panther, if we work together, this is what we can do.
Mm, mm. Let's see here. Any more
And
questions? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
right, this is what we can do, man. And I think it's gonna, it won't be easy. It will not. Culture sometimes will get in the way, different agendas, perhaps. But honestly, man, I think that the foundation for developing stronger partnerships has been laid.
Mm. So you think we can actually see a difference between African and African American relations with this movement?
Well, well, let me just say this, man. I think that at the very, very elite level, if you have an opportunity, let's just say, man, to interact with folks who are members of the Africa America Institute and the some of the governing elites of Africa, you'll see, man, again, there are already plans, programs in place where people are getting things done. I've actually seen it on quite a few levels. And even with the Africa America Institute, you and I talked about Yale, which during the President Obama's administration, when Melvin Foote, who's the president of the Constituency for Africa, developed Yale, and he brought literally hundreds of thousands of Africans from all over the continent to the U.S. for leadership development training. Basically, so they could learn perhaps new techniques to take back to their prospective countrymen, and and to make changes. So again, these organizations are just a few examples of what's been happening, man, over the last few decades.
Mm. Hey, real quick, somebody has a question. Why doesn't Professor Davis make a comparison between Americo Liberians and Haile Selassie giving the diaspora land in Ethiopia, and none of the Liberia stuff happened? Huh? Okay, he's saying, I guess
I'm not
Haile
quite sure.
Selassie, he said Haile Selassie gave Black Americans or the diaspora. I know he gave some Rastafarians land in Ethiopia, but he's saying he gave, I guess, Black Americans or the diaspora land in Ethiopia, and none of the, I guess, violence that Americo Liberians are being blamed for in Liberia happened in Ethiopia.
Well, here's the difference between Ethiopia and Liberia. I mean, Ethiopia was not a settler population. I mean, you had roughly 20,000 or so African Americans and West Indians who repatriated or settled in Africa. And and that maybe a few families from the Black diaspora actually settled in Ethiopia. I think that that those comparison mans are those, you're actually comparing apples and oranges with that. That doesn't make any sense.
Okay. Okay, cool. See if we got any other questions in the chat rooms. Um yeah, I think that's all the questions in the chat. And somebody said that the land that they gave to the Black Americans, the Ethiopians confiscated it. So I mean, I don't know if that's true or not, but
Well, you know what? Let me just say this, and this is slightly different. I can
go ahead.
tell you, man, that the person who opened up official diplomatic relationships between the United States and Ethiopia was a Black American by the name of William Ellis.
Mhm.
And William Ellis basically did that in 1903. He had gone to Ethiopia I believe in 1899. And he met with King Menelik,
Okay.
and he was able to. And Menelik actually annexed I forget how many acres, and he basically had created a cotton plantation there and made quite a bit of money. And he
Mhm.
came back to the United States and had met with one of the presidents of the United States that escapes me right now. But once that happened, he goes back to Ethiopia in 1903, carrying the treaty of, I guess, the treaty of diplomatic relations or something of that nature, opening up those official relationships back in 1903.
Mm. All right, cool. Let's see. You got any more questions in the chat room? Um, I think that's it, man. I mean, hey Chima, thank you so much for the super chats. I really appreciate it. Um, last question. Tate wants to know who was William Tolbert, correct? That's his name.
Right. Hmm.
How significant or who was William Tolbert? Can you tell us more about him?
Yeah, the president. He was the 19th, I believe, president of Liberia, man.
Hmm.
And he was because Tubman died in 71.
Hmm.
Tolbert was his vice president. He took over from Tubman from 71 until 1980 when he was assassinated. But what he was doing is he was continuing the policy of Tubman, which was the open door policy, bringing more, if you will, indigenous Liberians into into the mainstream. And like I said, unfortunately, one of the sergeants, Samuel Doe, basically had of course assassinated him with a lot of his cabinet members. And this was really the beginning of, if you will, the dark age for Liberia. It was the first time an indigenous person was the president of Liberia, but unfortunately, what uh, Doe did was actually create more friction between the six between the 16 ethnic groups, because because Doe was ethnically a Kron,
Hmm.
and he didn't like these other ethnic groups. And what Tolbert and Tubman were able to do is to keep the ethnic differences at bay when they were in power.
Oh, I was gonna ask what so in the Liberia Civil War, what tribes were fighting against each other then? If you know the
Oh
American
my God.
were
No,
really.
they were the crew, the Kron, the Gia, the Capella. I mean, the Gola. All of these tribes were going at it, and it was just the most horrific thing because there were a lot of child soldiers, man. And again, because the American Liberians had money and capital, many of them were able to leave. So it was really most of the fighting was done among the indigenous Liberians or
Mhm.
the you know or the folks who were there from the very beginning.
Mm. And Chima Madu said in the chat room, what they don't realize is that both of our struggles are linked. We went through colonialism and y'all went through slavery. We as a collective have been used and exploited.
Oh, sure, no question about it, man. And again, as I stated to you before, man, that that the beginning of Liberia was America's inability to to reckon with this increasingly free African American population across the Mid-Atlantic states and some of the northern states. Uh, Whites felt African American felt like they were in competition with these blacks, so we have to get rid of them. I mean, again, you're not equal to us. Maybe it would be best if you go back to Africa.
Mhm.
And so some people just took took the chance to go back and create something new. And again, they although it was difficult, man, they basically created a brand new country and society, and in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, as I stated earlier, man, it had become middle income.
Okay. See, we got any more questions in the chat room? But yeah, I mean, thank you, Professor Davis. It's been great, man. I appreciate you coming on. I mean, again, whenever you come on, you're a wealth of knowledge, man. So anything you want to share in closing, and how can people get in contact with you?
Honestly, what I would
tell, and I'm gonna have you do this every time you come on. Tell people in closing as well about the African American Institute as well.
Great. Okay, good question, man. Fantastic. The Africa American Institute was actually established in 1953 by two African American professors. The first one was Dr. Horace Bond, who is the father of Dr. Julian Bond, and Horace Bond was also the president of Lincoln University. And the second professor is Dr. William Leo Hasbury of Howard University. And Dr. Hasbury had actually established the African Studies Department at Howard in 1922. What these two professors wanted to do is to create an institution before most African nations received their independence, beginning with Ghana in 1957, and they did that. They actually because the Africa American Institute was, as I said, established in 1953, and so once Ghana got its independence, man, AAI for short was first to assist with Ghana in terms of leadership development training. Now, today, this very, very renowned and prestigious organization has a footprint on the ground in all 54 African countries. It has trained and educated literally tens of thousands of Africans. And many of the alumni you'll find are presidents, their prime ministers, their Nobel laureates, many also too are multi-million-dollar startups. I mean, it is an amazing organization. And also, as of January 2018, they are partnering with the NAACP to.
My bad. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
To continually engage the African continent. And so, again, this organization has been around for 65 years.
Okay, cool. And how can people get in contact with you if they want to ask any questions? And also, your book's coming out soon too. So I don't know if you want to talk about that yet, or you hold off. It's up to you.
Right. Well, we'll actually discuss that next time, man. And
okay, all right, no problem.
As a matter of fact, I'm going to be traveling too. I've been invited to the African American Museum in Seattle, Washington.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'll definitely go out and speak, and I'll talk about the Black American experience in the Pacific Northwest, and which is going to be pretty fascinating. But if anyone wants to reach me, they can reach me at davisln20750@yahoo.com. And they can send me an email, and and we can discuss some of the topics further when I have time.
All right, perfect. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Davis, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. Make sure you guys follow, like, share. If you're new to this this platform, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you go to Search for Huru on Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and Facebook. Make sure you guys go to searchforhuru.com, go to Instagram. Go to Amazon.com, search your name, Dynasty Mirror, please buy a book. And then also go to dynastymirror.com as well. I appreciate Kellen Cash says there's a bunch of Uncle Toms out here in Seattle. How do you feel about the Uncle Toms in Seattle?
Wait a minute. Well, listen, let me just say this, man. Look, the U.S. is a huge country, and and the diversity of the Black experience, man, is complex. So I don't want to call anyone an Uncle Tom. Let me just say this, man.
Uncle Tom was actually a good guy. Like, I never read the story, but they said Uncle Tom was a hero. Is that true, or?
Well, look, let me. Let's save that for a different conversation.
Okay, that's fine. Okay.
But but look, I will say that there is a large African American museum in Seattle,
Mm-hmm.
and so and I look forward to traveling out there.
Mm-hmm. All right, cool. All right, perfect. All right, you guys, everybody. He's all right. Hey, we'll cover that next time, Kelly Cash. The difference between an Uncle Tom and a Sambo. We'll cover that next time. So, all right. So, everybody, I appreciate you for coming on, Professor Davis. Thank you so much for coming on. I'll be back on later on today, this evening. So, till next time, peace.
Thanks so much. Take care now.
Oh no, thank.